from the diaphragm.
Yeah, I should take lessons from the project.
So let me see, and we're all visible, aren't we? You can see us all okay. I'm gonna bit back, but then I cover you now. This is better. No, this is good. Okay, and I think maybe a little bit to the there now. I think we're all kind of pretty much in frame. So I've started recording, but I don't think we're streaming live, so we will be sort of editing it out, cleaning the sound, and sort of streaming it. So first of all, just welcome very much on behalf of the Adler Foundation. I'm really excited. Actually, I think I'll speak to camera, and that way everyone sees and we see each other. Yes, it feels like a really important moment to be talking about this. And we have a really diverse table of people at the very cutting edge of exploring the implementation of carbon metrics, of carbon markets, of blockchain and compute, and the intersection of it all. And we've got a really diverse set of sort of starting points, as it were. We've got people like Ollie working in public policy as well as in direct innovation. And we have people like Aisling working directly in the blockchain, in the science, developing it. We've got people like Alex and Drew who are innovating in the sort of software space and the sort of entrepreneurship dimension. And we've got Professor van der Waal-Hede, who's studying really the area of green computing in particular and the environmental impact of ICT. So I think we're going to have a really rich and intersectional exploration of some of the nitty-gritty challenges and potential of this moment here at COP. So I'd like to begin by inviting everyone to introduce themselves and maybe also share what has led them to engage in the sort of intersection between carbon, CO2, and blockchains. And maybe we can begin with Aisling, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the very nice introduction and for having us all here. My name is Dr. Aisling Connolly. I'm a senior research scientist at the Divinity Foundation. And at Divinity, we focus on building and contributing to the Internet Computer Protocol. But to kind of give you a view of where I come from and how I come to blockchain and carbon, I think I'm very much interested in human rights and generally in technology. And everything I do all through my career and my studies has been towards that effect. So I work on the one hand on cryptography. So I look at the privacy side of things, trying to help people live a better kind of digital life. And this brings me to blockchain, which then is heavily criticized for the kind of environmental side. And so for me, it kind of makes zero sense to ignore the environmental side of technology development, because if you ignore that, then they won't have the nice rights and digital fund that I try to build for them. So I come also then into the kind of sustainability and climate space around blockchains, and there's no better place than to start looking at home. So over the last almost 2 years now, I look at the power consumption of the internet, of the network itself, of the internet computer, of the carbon footprint, what we can do to reduce this, how we can incentivize people to do this, and all this kind of stuff. So this is how I end up in this field.
Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to have you. I think sort of the diversity of your expertise around this and hands-on sort of nitty-gritty work as well as big picture work is really valuable. So thank you very much. Ollie.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Oli. I'm from the International Carbon Registry. What we do is we run a registry for carbon and climate projects. And we run a GHG program, so we have the methodological framework that project proponents need to adhere to. Essentially, to those that are not perhaps maybe not familiar to what registries do, we provide a set of rules. Then we have agreements with 15 different verification bodies around the world, which are contracted into the project to verify and validate the claims of the projects against our rules. So we set the rules on the table, then an independent auditor comes and verifies that and validates the claims. And one of the reasons that we are obviously doing this is to increase transparency, conformity, and standardization in the carbon markets. And for us, using blockchain technology was a means to an end, because using blockchain, issuing the carbon credits directly onto blockchain, we'll be able to follow it better for a longer period of time over through the whole life cycle of the actual project from retirement. So yeah, this is essentially what we see, and what I find that is really inspiring is that I started first dabbling in blockchain to we wanted to use this for tokenization of shares in companies, and I saw this as a silver bullet for beneficial ownership registration, and I really saw that there was a need in public governance for instead of using self-reporting, we could rely on blockchain technology and understand how things are connected and ownership is connected. But we didn't feel the demand, so to speak, for transparency in ownership and those structures, and actually received a lot of pushback on that. But in blockchain, we really feel that it's becoming a norm to have use blockchain to register climate projects and the carbon credits. And I think it's probably one of few industries where you're expected to be running something on blockchain instead of something more traditional, which I think is really positive, and I'm excited about it.
Thank you. That is a fascinating thing, that sort of blockchains are marginal outside of crypto in many arenas, but in this arena, their very nature has made them sort of the place to go, as it were, in terms of verification. Thank you very much. Please.
Yeah, so pleasure to be here with you all. So I'm Drew. I'm working at CarbonMark. So CarbonMark is a blockchain-based platform to facilitate the trade of tokenized environmental commodities. So I spent roughly the last 8 years, I'd say, in the climate finance space, primarily along the value chain of carbon credits, so project development, all the way to the actual trading of these assets themselves, including also renewable energy certificates and so on. And I'd say maybe in the last 3.5 years or so, I became much more interested in blockchain. I think at first, just because it was pretty fascinating that in a distributed way, people all over the world could contribute to the running of a network that has all sorts of different applications being built on it. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of blockchain is in relation to DeFi, or decentralized finance, where you have this concept of money Legos, basically meaning that people can build composable technology together and really drive a tremendous amount of innovation in building new and exciting applications. And as I kind of developed in my career in the climate finance space and started following this, I really thought about, wow, here is really infrastructure that we can start to leverage to drive innovation in this market, to make these environmental commodities programmable, where people can start to build new applications together and ultimately drive more capital to these carbon mitigation or carbon removal projects. And so that's really the underlying thesis of CarbonMark, is that we're building a platform where other people can build on top of us to create new and exciting technologies and applications. So yeah, excited to get into this discussion with you all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's, again, a really sort of interesting nexus in the sense of that the platform of innovation, it's a building block as a starting point as opposed to an end point, and that we are creating things here that both expand access, but also expand participation in a way that is novel in terms of climate finance, certainly, which obviously is becoming one of the hallmarks of this COP in particular. So thank you.
Great to be here, everyone, and good to meet you. So my name's Alex, and I work for Offsetra, co-founded a company called Offsetra. My background prior to that was in energy and energy markets, and related to energy was carbon and sustainability. So I come from there. And what we did at Offsetra, one of our kind of first innovations or products, was to really try and understand the carbon footprint of the Ethereum blockchain. And why did we do that? We initially started as a retailer in the carbon markets and had an interest in blockchain or cryptocurrency. And at the time, there was a lot of conversation about the energy and environmental impacts of blockchain, particularly Ethereum and Bitcoin, so proof of work consensus mechanisms. But what we found at the time, although there was a lot of conversation, hadn't really been defined at a specific level. So the statements were crypto or blockchain is bad for the environment, but they weren't saying how bad for the environment it was. So we busied ourselves to try and understand that properly, and come up with methodologies that you could use to actually understand the carbon impact of a transaction, of a wallet. So I kind of came at this from trying to attack the problem, because we were involved, I guess, in a personal level, interested in the blockchain space. We kind of were able to direct the company at this problem to try and solve it. So yeah, and since Offsetra, I've also contributed to a project called ClimaDAO, which I suppose has a similar approach. There's some challenges in the carbon markets where ClimaDAO is active, and Klima is trying to use blockchain technology as a mechanism to kind of address these problems, solve these problems. So I think technology's got great potential, and by applying it in these different sort of use cases, we can kind of work through the problems and kind of then define the benefits and see what the benefits are. So yeah, great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And again, really interesting, that sense of sort of that there are challenges, that for all the promises of this technology, that we're not looking at a smooth landscape, and that requires research, that requires accountability, that not all implementations are created equal, and the fact that sort of you chose to approach it that way from the start, and that you've been thinking about this in that way, and that as a business working with Ethereum, you pause to say, yes, but what are the implications of this technology we're building on top of? Is both really laudable, but also really critical, I think, to the challenges ahead. So thank you and welcome. And Wim, please welcome as well. Sort of, I know that in your case, your area of speciality is not blockchains, but it is the computing that's sort of common to blockchain. So yes, please.
So I'm Wim van der Buijden. I'm at the University of Glasgow School of Computing Science, and I focus there on low carbon and sustainable computing. And I consider myself, let's say, an environmentalist first and a computing scientist second. So that means that if it's about making decisions, I prefer to make the decisions that will help the environment than as opposed to the decisions that will help computing science, which as an academic is not always the obvious thing, because we're supposed to do science even if it's not relevant. So that's kind of my position, which means essentially I'm trying to convince a lot of people that our problems are not technological, in the sense that we cannot solve them through technology alone. And I think there will be no disagreement at the table on that, I'm sure. So Ismail is right. I am not working on doing research on blockchain. So I have rather, let's say, maybe extreme positions, well, some would say, but I am not opposed to blockchain per se. It's a cryptographic data structure. It's fine. I am much more skeptical about cryptocurrency specifically because of the impact of the proof of work. So that is one thing. And just to put my cards on the table, I am also very skeptical about anything to do with offsetting and carbon capture and storage, because just looking at the timelines, it is not, to my mind, the right course of action. On the other hand, I am much less skeptical about carbon credit trading, and I really think the blockchain has an important role in this to guarantee that it's done correctly and that nobody is trying to, get credits and then leak emissions somewhere. And I think that's really an important role. And I think, well, we have this great cryptographic data structure that can guarantee these things. We should put it to use. So I think we will have a lot to agree on, although also some things to disagree on.
So that is, again, thank you so much, and a really helpful sense of what the actual discussion is, that we have all of these voices, and that this is not a solution but a question, really, and that there is again not a smooth landscape. And I hope sort of that this is what we'll explore in a rich way. So your skepticism is very welcome, and I think sort of it will make the discussion all the more rigorous. I'm going to quickly pause the recording for a second because I realize that I have no resuming the recording.
Maybe you can
What's that?
realign it.
Is it off?
I think you are now more confident.
Did I move it a
If you
bit?
turn it a bit towards you. And it seems also still not comfortable.
Let me.
Shouldn't it?
Well, this too is being recorded. Is that what you meant?
More towards you and then. Yeah.
Is that okay?
You're in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's start. Oh, we are recording, that's good. Okay, so part two. Yes, so I guess Vim, you introduced really the next theme. One of the areas that in this series of proof of green discussions we explored yesterday, I think, with Professor Rennie, was the role of legitimacy in blockchains. And that's what led you, Aisling, to sort of get into sustainability. You wanted privacy, and suddenly there was this legitimacy sort of storm back around environmental. Like, okay, I better make it sort of environmental. And in the same way, I think carbon offsets, carbon markets in general, have a challenge of legitimacy in the same way. And I think that's going to grow after this COP, because the expansion of it looks set to be as stratospheric. And it was interesting, again, in relation to sort of Vim's mention of crypto. I saw a headline which was very pertinent. They asked, are carbon credits the new crypto? And there are interesting parallels there in terms of the amount of money that's coming into this, the room for speculation, etc. And on the other hand, I was sharing with Aisling that for me personally, coming here on behalf of the Adora Foundation was a dilemma. I'm flying to a COP. It's a real dilemma. Part of me thought, well, I believe this can be worthwhile, and that I can kind of, I'll work very hard to justify it so that the positive impact outweighs the negative impact. And on the other, I thought, and I'd like to offset the sort of the 3 or 4 tons of CO2 that I've incurred in this. And as I looked at it, there were a number of sort of scenarios. On the one hand, you will be aware of the sort of, I think it's called government accountability, government NGO with The Guardian. The Guardian sort of put it on the map. They did this research. It was quite rigorous. 4 independent experts sort of validated the methodology, and they concluded that essentially they looked at the 50 biggest ones or 50 of the biggest schemes, and they qualified all of them. I think they are very emotive in their language. They qualified them as junk. I think that's less useful than what they actually described. They actually describe very specific things around, for example, the failure and impossibility to guarantee that emissions were reducing, that they would be sustained throughout a lifetime, that the emissions were not being displaced somewhere else. And there were only 3 that they did not sort of find sort of serious failures with, and it's because they didn't have enough information for it. So obviously that's created that context. The last element that I want to sort of frame before sort of bringing it back to you is that from my perspective, sort of where I'm starting point, my starting point, that I'm really happy to be sort of challenged or corrected around any of these, but it's that I am 100% on board with the idea that offsets are not a replacement for emissions reductions. I think that's something that now everybody accepts, whether it's paying lip service to it or not, is not something that anybody will question. I also think that there is no scenario where that transition happens without some excess emissions. So from my perspective, Dim and I have been working on this. I created a model for sustainable computing where you had these various steps of sort of greening by default and then green mode. And then at the end, you do residual offsetting, because at the end, you'll always have something extra. So for me, there is a role in offsetting in principle. And secondly, I have seen how climate finance and these schemes have empowered local communities, have brought finances to indigenous communities to pursue their work. I've also seen how, right now, for example, again in the news, someone bought something like 3% of the landmass of sort of something like 15 different African countries for carbon offsetting of forest land without any ownership by the communities that live there in that process. So this is just to say it's messy. I'm sure everyone is agreed on how it's messy. So I guess I'd like to ask, particularly those of you who are at the forefront of this, where do you stand in this messy landscape, in this element of sort of some outrageously bad implementations and some potentially promising implementations, and that spectrum between, we don't have time, so we shouldn't offset, and we can offset, so therefore let's open new oil fields. So Ollie, perhaps you would like to start.
Yeah, so maybe first to address like what you mentioned about projects in the past, that when you look at them, they might not be what was expected. I think part of it is that there were bad projects, obviously, but part of it is also that it's a new industry that was trying to be created. And I think we can't be too judgmental, looking back at everything and then judging everything by the size or the amount of the bad apples in that batch. We need to figure out a step forward to figure out how do we reduce the bad apples, because we still have the same problem, and they were trying to provide a solution to that problem. That said, we can do that in many ways, like adding more digital monitoring services on top of it, increasing transparency, traceability, and stuff like that. But I think the most crucial thing is we need to accept that we need to evolve and we need to adapt. We cannot really go to this is the silver bullet. No, this silver bullet didn't work. Let's quit that and find a way for a new silver bullet. We need to, we're not utilizing all the same resources for all the same problems. So we can't do direct air capture and storage. We can't do nature-based solutions because it's not the same resources that would go towards it. It's different people, it's different human labor, it's different areas, different backgrounds. So my perspective is that we need to do everything that we can, and we just need more. We need more brains, we need more money, and as long as we accept the fact that this is a huge problem and CO2 is a common good that we are generally costing the planet and the livelihood of other people, we need to figure out a solution. And reduction is definitely important, and we need to be more efficient. But people will want to live, people will want to be entertained, people will want to do something fun. So we need to figure out a way to do that more efficiently that costs the environment less. And lastly, maybe to address the thing that even though if the developed nations would just cut their emissions drastically by half or some insane amount, we still have billions of people that are trying to increase the quality of life. And we cannot really just say like, hey, can't do it the same way we did. So you just stop. We need to figure out a way how we will evolve as a whole, because it's not just our current emissions that are a problem. It's also how we will handle the future emissions. So our stand is we need everything on the table, and we need to do, learn, and iterate.
That's a really important point, this notion that actually, and it applies, I think, also to blockchains, really, that this is an early stage set of approaches and technologies, and that a lot of people went out with very good intentions, for example, and planted lots of trees that were not in tune with the biodiversity, and they actually destroyed the ecosystem in the process, but they were coming from the right place in that sense, and that the very standards that were used to dam, as it were, these schemes suggest that there are ways of doing it that could have passed. In other words, that there are standards what could apply and therefore evolve the way that these implementations are taking place. Drew, please, what?
Alex,
sorry,
yeah, maybe to come in on the role of offsetting and answer that question from my perspective, or maybe from what I saw back when I was starting to get involved. I think it was really interesting, as I mentioned at the beginning, when these criticisms of blockchain technologies as a whole came out, there was this kind of foregone conclusion that adoption of these technologies was going to scale in some cases, significantly, exponentially. but there was no solution, or there was no option for people to either reduce the emissions of their actions because of the nature of the proof of work blockchain. And at the time, there wasn't really knowledge or a feeling around the role of carbon offsetting. So this process that the blockchain community went through, I guess, is a kind of nice example of how offsetting can and perhaps should be thought about, which is this concept of the emissions hierarchy, right? You should first of all avoid emissions where you can, by not deliberately or without further thought taking carbon intensive or undertaking carbon intensive activities. Then you should mitigate your emissions. Can you switch technologies to mitigate emissions, and then you should offset them. So in the case of proof of work, there was no option to really mitigate because proof of work consensus mechanism is what it is. And offsetting wasn't really used. However, the Ethereum Foundation did come out and decide to transition from proof of work to proof of stake, partly in response to the environmental implications that were being understood around proof of work technologies. But in that gap between transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake, the community wanted to do something. They wanted to demonstrate that perhaps they, although they now understand that there are environmental implications of blockchain technologies, they want to do something about it. And I think offsetting, using carbon credits was an avenue for that community to participate in something that they felt was positive. And I would take the point around the fact that there can be questions around the effectiveness of projects, but they still wanted to participate. And offsetting provides an outlet for that kind of drive to have an impact. Not to say that there shouldn't be more actions taken to mitigate the impact of the technology. And I think Ethereum has proven that even a complex technology can be improved to be made more efficient. But there's different times that we have to implement different measures. And to the point you made around, it's all well and good as sat here and in Dubai having a nice time. But there's other people who do want growth, and they do want to consume energy. In the case of blockchains is what this comes down to. So I think it's right to come up with different solutions for the problems, and different solutions that can be deployed at different times. And I think this journey that the Ethereum community went on in particular is kind of a nice example of how that's also happened in other technologies. Internal combustion engine vehicles, right? We came up with offsetting solutions for ICEs until we finally had electric vehicles, and this is a process that we're seeing happen a lot. We can speculate on whether it's right or wrong, but it's sort of happening, and generally I see positivity from the fact that it's happening.
So in that sense, it's a kind of whatever your position of setting, it is here. It's not you can't just go no setting because it's going to happen. So it's about kind of making it effective and recognizing that it is a transitional process, that it's not doesn't replace the rest, it doesn't replace that evolution, but that there are equity issues around reductions and timeline issues around reductions. And so Ethereum, in the example you gave, was initially caught structurally in a place where mitigation was sort of pretty much not an option. And it began by pursuing offsetting before finally landing on sort of a significant improvement to its direct kind of energy consumption. Then what is your perspective in terms of that broader framework, that sense that that offsets are not the solution, that they are part of the landscape of solutions, and that their implementation has been imperfect, but it is perfectible, as it were. And so the answer is not to walk away, but to actually improve it and make it work.
Well, if we consider two types of offsetting, so the first being if you trade your excess emissions for somebody else's deficit in emissions, and you're not reducing emissions at all. On the other hand, if you offset through biomass, you could reduce emissions. The problem is that the actual scope of all the additional biomass on the planet is only 100 gigatons of CO2. I say only, but that's 2 years of our current emissions. That's it. Then we have planted the trees and filled them with carbon, and there it stops. And therefore, it cannot be seen as a solution. And that's my main concern with offsetting, is not that it's not effective, but that if everybody says they're going to offset their emissions, that is impossible. There is simply not enough biomass on the planet to offset all emissions. And the same is true for carbon capture and storage. Even if we would get it to work at scale really quickly, it will not be at a scale that it can simply offset all our emissions. And so, I mean, I fully agree that people should want to live their lives and get progress and so on. But for that, they need energy. They don't need emissions. So there's a big... if we can produce clean energy to raise people's lifestyles, we're fine. And I think my position is actually the next 15 to 20 years are absolutely critical. And I would really, it would be a shame if we got distracted by saying, oh, we don't need to reduce emissions, we simply can offset them, because that will lead literally to disaster. That's really my position. So on the other hand, for the marginal, so for what remains after you've reduced everything, we will have to offset. We will have to use CSS, and I think eventually we'll get it to work at scale at the source. And I think I've said that before, but maybe not to you, Ismail. I don't know. But I think if we manage to do right thing in the next 20 years, after that, our future will be really bright, because we are going to have great technologies for being really green. And but the problem is that we have to get there without causing a massive disaster that will affect huge amounts of people, because lots of areas of the planet will become uninhabitable, right? And that will lead to conflict and so on. So if we mess it up, it will be really bad. If we don't mess it up, it will be really good. So the choice seems easy to my mind. Yeah, that's kind of my take on it. So my worry with the offsetting is not that it does not work per se, but that the scope is limited, and that people should realize that they should use it kind of as a last resort rather than as a primary mechanism. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point and a really important message. It reminds me of our discussions that we will be sort of publishing and sharing soon around carbon-aware patterns. And it's that there are boundaries. And I think that this is really, really important, that yes, we do not have the capacity to offset, like the planetary capacity. If everyone decided to offset, and we could appropriate all the available resources in the planet, we'd last 2 years in that sense. So that's a really important point.
If I'm entirely fair, there are proposed solutions where you char the biomass and then start over again, and that results in additional capacity, but it's not really been shown at any scale. So just for context, so the UK research funding councils have looked at this into detail, and their position is that they cannot actually support the argument of offsetting at the moment, for essentially for the reasons that I've been bringing up. So that means that effectively people cannot ask for money to offset their emissions on grants, but because that's only the remit that this organization has. But the UK Research Funding Council has all the available expertise in the UK to draw on to reach such a conclusion. So I think it is something to be taken seriously. That's kind of the position.
Thank you for that. So one element that I think is really important is the point that you made about boundaries. And the second point that I think is also very important is the distinction you made between emissions and energy, and the idea that actually another of the great things that is happening, not just in COP, that it's really probably the single greatest success story since COP21, since the Paris Agreement, is the acceleration of renewable energy. and that's going to expand further. So it seems to me that it reminded me of the sort of the way economies transform around World War II to a war footing. And all the industries changed, and all the factories changed, and all the businesses changed, so that weapons could go into the field and people could go into the field. And it seems to me that we're in a similar process right now globally, that we are sort of redesigning and redirecting all our resources in new ways, and that the boundaries mean that they have to come in tandem, that you can't do offsetting without green energy, that you can't do green energy without reducing demand, that actually doesn't matter how much you grow, the solutions, we don't have the resources to sustain those solutions. So along those lines, I wanted to invite you, drew this line correctly, apologies, what is your perspective on this, and what is your perspective on the role of sort of blockchains in that distinguishing and verifying and creating trust in good implementations, that if we arrive at good standards, if, for example, we take the benchmarks that were used to measure those top 50 and find them wanting, and we say, these are the benchmarks that we now want to apply to ensure that, you know, these are proper, these projects are being implemented properly. Where did you see, sort of in terms of, as you are building this platform, where does that platform fit into this discussion?
So I think what we need to be doing is we need to be identifying the leverage points that are most effective to mitigate and remove carbon, right? So if you just take the statistic from, I think, the last IPCC report on forest degradation and land degradation, resulting in, you know, nearly 12% of anthropogenic emissions globally. So that means that if we're directing capital to actually just preserve the biomass that is already here, we can have a pretty massive impact on the emissions that are occurring from land degradation. And so I think it's about identifying what are these different leverage points and how can carbon credits themselves serve as a financing mechanism for them. Because let's not forget that the basis of a high quality carbon credit is that it's additional, meaning that the financing from that project, from selling those credits, is actually necessary to make it economically viable, right? This is about delivering capital to those solutions so that they can actually develop and scale up and so on. And I think, you know, renewables are a success case there, right? In most countries today, you can't produce a carbon credit from a renewable power installation because now it's cost competitive with fossil fuels, right? And so that's what we want to see with other technologies as well. Is we want to use these, you know, financial tools to help these technologies further develop. Now, to bring that then to blockchain, right? I think there's a variety of technologies that can help measure that effectiveness. I think DMRV, digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, and having that data available on chain for projects is super exciting because, of course, then we have, you know, potentially in near real time evidence about the integrity of these projects. You know, are trees being cut down? You know, are they being maintained? Are there any wildfires that we need to be concerned about, and so on? Or measuring the electricity output of those renewable projects that are still happening today in some low resource countries where those projects are being developed, and then having that information live. That's a really interesting point. And where blockchain comes in there is, one, live updating the integrity of the credits on chain, but then linking them to other activity that you can pull onto the blockchain. So a quick example of that is, you know, something we're working on with a partner with the SAP integration, where they're automatically computing the emissions of business activity. So for example, supply chain transfers and things of this nature. So now you have the carbon account of these different activities, and in real time, you can then match that with carbon credits that are on chain that, you know, let's say may have relevance based on the geography of the supply chain or the technology types that are relevant to that company, for example. And you have a complete chain of custody and the flow of the finance from credits being generated from a project, the emissions on one side, and then linking that together. And I think really what that's all about is essentially allowing our economy to act a bit more intelligently when it comes to emissions and the cost of those emissions, and then dealing with them and making sure that that finance goes to those projects which help mitigate it.
So it's another really important point is the potential, again, of this sort of integration where it's not one thing or another, and the potential of offsets as a mechanism of additionality, of being able to not just trade sort of your excess emissions for those that are saved and there's been no change, but actually to empower the expansion, the growth. There are sort of, for example, one of the both opportunities and risks of this process. One of the risks is the centralization of these processes. So in the example of sort of the country that just bought this massive sort of chunk of Africa as a whole, there is a potential there to preserve biomass at scale. That's it, it's bought. And if they do it in that way, it's preserved. But there is no direct participation in that process from the communities. And that can lead to all kinds of perverse effects. There is also the alternative. There is the alternative where actually this additionality can empower marginalized communities that do not have access. I know where I live in Mérida, in Yucatan, Mayan communities are really struggling to be heard and really struggling to gain resources for basic roads, and where sort of there is a hurricane for climate change. I remember one Mayan leader saying the mothers are climbing with their babies onto the top of the hill because there is no infrastructure. And yet they are empirically, the evidence is that they have been the most effective custodians of that biomass in that period. So here is the potential of this finance to create additionality at that grassroots level and bypass so many other stages in that sense. So that's a really powerful point. And Aisling, I wanted to ask you about sort of that implementation level. So we're talking about blockchain generically, but obviously blockchains are really diverse. And, we've already mentioned proof of stake versus proof of work, but that's just scratching the surface of the diversity of implementations. And I wanted to ask you from your perspective, sort of in the nuts and bolts of the internet computer blockchain and your more general expertise, how generic is the role of blockchains? As in, I want to implement sort of this verification process in a blockchain. Can I just pick any to build on top of? Is it the same to build on top of sort of Ethereum, the internet computer, etc.? Are there sort of blockchains that are more suited? Would you say that it would be better to develop or a mix specialist blockchains that are only ledgers for this, or build on top of those ecosystems that already exist? Sort of, yeah, where does that process sit from your perspective?
There's too much to say. I think it's a very good question. And I think if you go around COP, actually, there are not very many people at COP, which is an interesting observation in itself.
Not many people from the blockchain ecosystem.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, exactly. Like there's just, I really didn't see any. But if you ask blockchain people in general, you will find a different answer from everybody on the questions. Like you can do whatever you want, basically. It's a general purpose computing platform, you can do whatever you want. But from my perspective, there's a few things to get straight first. I mean, I think in any progressive situation, you should take a principled approach, and then it's a very easy decision on how to progress. And I think there are a few things to understand about the world in general, but they also apply to blockchains. And one is just kind of knowing what they're good for, and then choosing how you want to use that. And so you hear a lot of narrative about proof of stake and proof of work, and this is bad and this is better. And I mean, I think if you understand blockchains fundamentally, you kind of understand that it's a bit different to that. And it's a bit like you said, like people don't need to burn oil, they need energy. And it's not that proof of work inherently is bad. It's the incentive mechanism around the proof of work of the particular blockchain of Bitcoin that became so high that people optimize so much so that they do, they use a lot of machines to do a lot of work. But that's an economic thing. It's not the algorithmic, it's nothing to do with proof of work itself. It's the economic incentive around it that drove the social behavior that then turned into an energy and efficient thing. And this is a bit, I mean, if we want to give a shout to proof of green, this is where a bit the concept for proof of green came from. It's not about proof of work, proof of stake, whatever. It's about the kind of social or kind of like, the global situation around that kind of forces this situation on a particular thing. So that's one thing to understand about blockchains. The technology itself is not inherently bad. It's maybe how it's used, or like in Ethereum, proof of stake, we say, proof of stake is great. But now if you look, there are 1 million validators. And so every transaction that I process on Ethereum is replicated 1 million times. I mean, is that needed for every small degen NFT move that you make? No. So yes, it's good for security, not needed for everything. And the same with the proof of work on Bitcoin, great for security, not needed for everything. And so when you asked about what kind of chains to build on, all these different chains, blockchain solutions have their different kind of use cases and their different benefits and their different negative points. So Bitcoin, great for maybe a store of value. Ethereum, great for maybe like high security, small amount of transfers. And the other kind of newer chains that came along after this kind of focused much more on this general purpose computation and wanted to have like a much more efficient, both in terms of like computational efficiency, because if we want to build trustless systems for the world, they can't be slow and they need to scale to the billions of users. And they, so they've been designed with efficiency in mind to scale to billions of users. But then by like for free, you get this sustainability aspect, because if you have efficient machines and you stop burning oil, basically, then you get sustainability for free. So I think if you want to build, credit tracking or, credit marketplaces or whatever kind of thing, it's better to do it on one of these kind of more sustainable blockchains, let's say. But then the other question is like, who is actually ready for this now? And so, I mean, yesterday at COP, we launched on the main stage in partnership with Roland Berger, a platform for recycling credits, a registry that can be checked. And so every sort of, if I am a recycler and I go to recycle, 10 tons of aluminium, I get some certification for this, I upload it to the blockchain, I then get some carbon credits for this, and then I can either sell them or use them to certify that I'm carbon neutral, all this kind of stuff. So this exists now and is being like prepared for use by various governments around the world. And so there are blockchain solutions that exist for the global kind of economy. The last thing to kind of note about a few of the points, I think the nice thing about blockchains as well is that there is this, so you have the trustlessness, you have the transparency, anybody can check these registries, you don't have to trust that there's no kind of fraud going on in the background or whatever corruption that often happens. And there is transparency, there is traceability, they are tamper-proof, you can't mess with it, but they're also accessible. I don't need, like, anybody can build these solutions. So if there are, like smaller communities and less developed areas, they can just build something for their own community that suits them, that is, that they understand. If there's land around them, they can monitor. And I mean, if you use the kind of big tech as it exists now, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whatever, this is not available, even in sometimes places like this, or in various places in Africa, or you need credit cards, you need whatever. I mean, it's not easy to build technology. So I think the one thing that really stands out about blockchain, along with the transparency and the tamper-proof, is this accessibility, that it's there for everyone. It's a public good. Pick it up and use it. So I think, so to answer the question in a roundabout way, you can do anything on a blockchain, but different blockchains are useful for different things. So choose the one that is kind of as open and accessible and as kind of scalable for the solution you need.
So there is a diversity in that sense. I love your phrase, by the way. I think that's very much sort of the heart of the whole Edinburgh Foundation approach. Is this, you said, if in a progressive situation, if you take a principal solution, the decision making becomes easy in that sense. And I think elevating to first principles, and we've had the example of it's energy, not oil. In this case, it's green, not steak or work, etc. And I know in previous discussions, been one of the points that you make very often, which is very important, is that it doesn't matter what outputs you are doing, it's are emissions actually being reduced or not. So it's this sort of principles beginning from those values ultimately of what kind of society and people we want to be. The second is that it is useful for people to know. I think that when they are thinking of implementing sort of green verification solutions on top of blockchains, that there are different blockchains for different use cases, and that sort of some of them will be more intensive than others, some of them will be more accessible than others, and some you might not need much access because you're verifying things between 20 people and it's your organization, and others you'd want to be able to build apps on top of because you do want sort of communities and individuals to be able to communicate in general. So having that sense of sort of fit to purpose is an important criteria, and not seeing things in knee-jerk ways. I think this one is good and this one is bad, or this victory is an absolute victory versus another one, which I think brings us to the blockchain itself. And so let's assume that now we all agree we're going to build some evolution on our sort of current approaches to verification. We're going to build them taking advantage of the, I want to say, potentially democratic nature of blockchains and the potentially democratic nature of climate finance. And we want to bring all this best practice at scale and make it available to the world. Now, the blockchains themselves, as Alex introduced, will have an emissionality of its own. So we are building on top of that. And in some cases, we are blind. In some cases, we need to sort of look to sort of third parties. How do you, particularly those of you who are already building, how do you approach the emissions of the blockchains that are powering your solutions and proposed solutions? So, Ole, perhaps we could start with yourself.
Perhaps not to speak too much of the technology itself and how much power each, because it's not my specialty. The first thing that comes to mind is that we need a set of methodology to actually be able to apply to different set of blockchains so we can actually compare them. One thing that just came into mind, like, do we need the validators to give their source of like origin, and do we actually need to analyze that, and do we need them to report what electricity they are using? I mean, it's a huge thing if you want to analyze it on the global scale. But I think I very much agree with what you said, that we need to be mindful of what we're using the actual blockchains for. Is the electricity consumption or power consumption, is it reasonable for what you're actually trying to do. Is it very often? Is it low value or is it high value? And what is the benefit? Another benefit is there must be some or one thought is that everyone's using the different sets of blockchains and everybody's building here and then there, and then we need to run that and run this, and we need to figure out a more efficient way on how chains can communicate and ecosystems can communicate with each other, because we can make that more efficient. We will cost less friction in the system. So, but from our perspective, I mean, companies need to be mindful. Are we using, like, what types of air bulbs or light bulbs are we using? What types of blockchains are we using? What types of cars are we using? This needs to be accounted for somehow in the scope of each company, and so it's a more like a company approach and then the global approach, but creating a set of methodologies around like what is good and how are we going to compare those things is something that is very interesting. And honestly, I hadn't really paid too much thought towards too, but
And that's really helpful. I think this is one of the sort of reasons I was excited to have you here, because it is, in that sense, it's been helpful to hear is what would you need, right? It's like most people are not actually in the weeds of the energy consumption of blockchains. So what I'm hearing is that that if you had sort of, I know that you're working very much with ISO standards, etc. If you had some sort of basic information that you were able to rely on to be able to factor in the same way that you factor in what type of light bulbs, then you'd be able to go, okay, this is how I factor it in. And it's not something that has come into your radar right now because it's not widely available. It's not sort of, when you're building, it doesn't come at you saying, this is the way we measure our impact, this is our methodology, and this is our actual impact, and this is the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason is as well that companies haven't really started the process of actually checking their emissions and their scopes that intricately. But this will happen in the future. And one possible way forward could be that blockchains and foundations would proactively and collaboratively go into developing a set of methodology that can be applied. We can start the discussion, we can discuss the principles, and then moving forward, it will be easier for people and companies that are using blockchains to account for it in their scope emissions. So that could be a potential solution, or not a solution, but input into that.
So I think it's a good place to maybe share and sort of bring it back to the discussion, the concept of proof of green. So proof of green is an initiative that was born collaboratively from conversations between the Adora Foundation and Carbon Crowd, and then the Affinity Foundation and the Internet Computer, and now extending Professor Rennie has become very supportive, and this is one of the purposes, is to really see how this resonates with you, and it's very similar. In fact, you've really defined it. The idea is that there are already many methodologies out there for measuring the footprints of different blockchains. Not of all blockchains, certainly for Bitcoin, for Ethereum. More generally, there are many methodologies for measuring the impact of computing. But I think in the blockchain ecosystem in particular, we lack a common language. There isn't a kind of consensus of how do we speak about these things. And every chain, you can look at 10 lists, and every chain saying, we are the greenest chain out of all the chains. And there might be, but there is no sort of ground for commonality. So the idea of proof of green is to create that point of contact that is chain agnostic, that is methodology agnostic, and that is neutral. And that it's a place where blockchains, businesses, developers, regulators can all speak the same language. And the approach that we are proposing is inspired by something that comes in software, in the world of software, to describe APIs. There are specifications like Open API, Async API, which do not necessarily impose a minimum standard. They impose a description format. So they don't tell you you have to do attributional or consequential accounting in this case, but you have to say what kind of accounting you are doing. You don't have to say sort of, you have to measure your electricity in this way or use this electricity, but you have to say, how are you approaching your electricity consumption? So creating this minimum viable description that allows people to diverge a lot, to be able to build completely different things, to have different standards and metrics and say mine is better than yours, but to describe them in a really consistent way, where you can even build tooling automatically that allows you to go. And then people can, both technical people and non-technical people, can know how to predict and translate among them. So I wanted to just quickly come back to you and then sort of go around. Would that approach sort of speak to what you were kind of calling for just then?
Yes, I mean, looking from it from the perspective of what standards in general do, like International Copyright Registry or FERA or others, what they're trying to do is proposing a set of rules that people can use as a recipe for what they're doing. And then they can apply that recipe to different projects, but it allows for some variables in the mix. So yes, I think like there can't be. I would always recommend using existing structure. For instance, look what's available in under the ISO standard to use this. And use the knowledge and the experience that has been building up, so we can actually translate what's happening here into what's already being built. Because we often also see people that are trying to reinvent the wheel when we shouldn't be reinventing it, we should be improving it. So, but it's definitely in the same vision, and through dialogue and discussions like this, we can share tools. So I think we're definitely on the same path.
And that's a really important point, that precisely the idea of this is to focus on description rather than implementation, because implementation exists. So it's not about creating, not replacing ISO standards or the ITU standards or the CCRI methodology. Yeah. It's about being able to correlate them. So to be able to say, which standard are you using, as opposed to you must use this standard.
Yeah, what methodology are you are you using? And then the standard and the framework come and they validate the blockchain foundation against those claims. So everybody has the same set of rules, and then the validator would come and check if they are doing what they are actually doing.
Thank you. And Alex, what are your perspectives?
Yeah, I think if we can put processes in place, maybe we can also close the gap around the uncertainties of the whole endeavor of defining and understanding carbon footprints. A couple of examples I think Ollie actually touched upon, with Ethereum, which wants to be decentralized distributed network. There's a lot of assumptions when trying to figure out the carbon impact of the network, because you don't know where the validators are actually based. A validator in China will have a vastly different impact to a validator in Norway, vastly different impact to the one in Europe. So if there's standards that can allow us to think about these problems and realistically, it's probably going to have to be through self-reporting. Maybe we can start to build up a bigger or more accurate picture of what the true situation is. And similarly, another challenge that I guess we run into a little bit is this concept of scopes. So you've got your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. How does that fit in? Does that fit in with blockchains at all? For example, the Klima project is on Polygon. Polygon gets its security from Ethereum, so it checkpoints batches onto Ethereum. But Polygon itself is a layer, so it's much more efficient. You can have a higher transaction throughput. So, but because it uses Ethereum, does Polygon have scope 3? Could you use the traditional scopes for Polygon's dependence on Ethereum? Or because all of the validating activity is happening on Ethereum already, is Ethereum's footprint, should we look at that in isolation? So how do these blockchains actually, they sometimes do depend on each other, and when they do depend on each other, how do we actually think about that, and how do we attribute responsibility if that's what we want to do? So yeah, there's some big questions that I think haven't been fully solved, and I think what you described about proof of green can help us get closer to the answers to these questions.
Thank you. Vim, I wonder whether you'd want to comment on that element of scopes around blockchains and the applicability of scope 3, and that particular example where you have a Polygon on top of Ethereum, on top of course, all of the nodes. If you were trying to describe again, sort of thinking about sort of proof of green, not as a standard of implementation, but as a standard of description and self-reporting. If you wanted to say, this is how I'm approaching scope 3, how would scope 3 relate to that scenario?
I think what you want to look at is the differential in work and then consequently in emissions resulting from that work, because of the service that you offer. So does it make any difference, the operation that you're doing to the service that you provide to the total emissions, or would they be the same if you weren't there? That's essentially how scope 3 operates, right? It is, I mean, the scope distinction is sometimes very hard to make, but it's just that scope 1 and 2 are easy to track. Scope 3 as well. Are any emissions occurring because of any activity that you do, even though those emissions are not under your direct control? And so in the context of the blockchain, that must translate to the work that is caused by your service that you offer on top of it. There was another thing that I was thinking about though during the whole discussion, which is very interesting, is another very important effectively scope 3 part is the embodied carbon of all the infrastructure that supports the blockchain. And in particular, it was the fact that Aisling said that there's so many transactions, validators in Ethereum now that they've moved to proof of stake, right? So the question is, are all these validators running on new hardware or on existing hardware? Because if they're running on new hardware, then the embodied carbon cost is enormous. If they run on existing hardware, then the embodied carbon doesn't change. With proof of work, the embodied carbon is as a consequence actually very high because the incentive to upgrade to newer miners is very high, and the volume is also very high. And so that is a scope 3 aspect that I think is important to take into account. Now, also, what I was also thinking when Ishmael, when you start introducing the proof of green, a very important part of this to my mind is what is the projected growth of the technology in terms of its energy use? Because, I mean, of course, I don't like it that people are burning cycles just to calculate in random numbers. I mean, fundamentally, I think this is as ugly as it gets personally. But the total amount of emissions from the blockchain right now is not a problem. I mean, that's the reality. It's not a problem. If it would stay at this level, if we could keep it like that for 20 years, there would be no problem. It would be better if we divided it by 4, because then that's our carbon budget roughly. We have to everyone has to divide by 4, so we should also have to divide by 4. But even if we didn't, with the current scales, it's not a massive problem. It's more a matter of proportionality and taking responsibility and leading by example. But it's important to keep into that at the back of one's mind. If it would grow by a factor of 10, of course, it would become a problem. So that's kind of my take on this. We need to put this into perspective, right? Yeah, blockchain, awful, how bad it is for the planet. And I mean, I agree with the arguments fully, but I think it's always important to see the proportionality of this. In terms of the total emissions from ICT, blockchain are still quite small. If it would grow dramatically, then we would really have to work much harder to reduce the emissions. If that is not projected, then we have a bit more slack, I would say. Yeah, that's
Thank
kind
you. And I think that's a reminder again. I think we are so polarized, and the information ecosystem in which we exist is such an accelerator of polarization. But none of these solutions happen without proportionality, without actually looking at the evidence. And that's another reason why I think that one of the pitches of proof of green is around that legitimacy, is the fact that actually whatever the problems of the blockchain in relation to the contribution of ICT to emissions, they're dwarfed by data centers and IT, etc., but they haven't received remotely the same pushback. And that's not just about a question of fairness, but it's a question of effectiveness, of where we concentrate our attention. So being able to have something that allows people transparently to say, oh, this is where it fits. And it's not just because I think part of and won't have time to touch on this, but I think part of it is the interaction between the market sort of dimension of cryptos that sort of bleeds through into the actual computing ones. But the other element around scope 3 is, yes, that element of embodied carbon. And the other element I think that I would add is sort of who is using your app. I think it would not be so much on the Ethereum side, but more on the users of your app. Sort of, are people having to travel to use that app? Is sort of the implementation of that particular application requiring sort of the creation of a building or the buying of computers by people in order to use it? Those would be some of the things that you might add into it. I wanted to ask Aisling, again at a more sort of granular level. So you've really been breaking ground in Internet Computer with this. And we have a fantastic interview with Orlando from Carbon Crowd on sort of that journey from where you sort of commissioned them to do an impact report, an environmental scope 1 impact of your compute, a bit like what you tried to do for Ethereum or what you did for Ethereum when starting out. But now you've actually added this dashboard that gives you real-time information on every node.
Exactly. So I think this goes to your point. Like when we worked with Carbon Crowd to calculate the carbon footprint basically of the Internet Computer blockchain. And so in order to get this, we needed to know. So we do know where the nodes are, and we know the geographical location of every single validator, basically. And so from this, we also wanted to get some power consumption readings. And at the start, we actually went to the data center with the machine and, touch the wires and say, yeah, there's this much power being drawn. But also because of the type of machines that we use, we can get them to actually self-report through a management interface how much power consumption they are actually using. So given that we know, and so they do this now every minute publicly. So we know every minute in real-ish time what is the power consumption of any given node? We know its location, and so we can in real time calculate the carbon footprint. I think for me, this is a bit where the proof of green idea came from originally, because we were like, hey, here are our watts. If you want to know, I mean, you can see them, there's a public API, go see them. Now they're pushed to the dashboard every minute. And so for me, this was, yeah, very much the kind of, hey, we want to build transparent solutions, and we praise all these, and we kind of, say all these things about blockchains and why you should use them. It's like, okay, we should do it ourselves. I mean, and here is my proof of this is, we all claim, yeah, that we're very green. But yeah, here is some proof of it. I think this was the main thing that we did towards that. And I think this came out of the working with Carbon Proud, because yeah, first getting the readings, then we realized actually we can just push them live every minute. And so yeah, I think this was one of the nicest.
I have to say, so I want to first of all also just give kudos in terms of the fact that I think it's always a bit of a risk to commission a study like that, right? Because you don't really know what's going to come back. And so we chose to go there. The news wasn't bad, so it was easier, I guess, to move forward with a disclosure and a dashboard. But one of the things that I've been very sort of encouraged in our collaboration with the Internet Computer and with Affinity is that as we began to explore proof of green, one of the core principles, aside from not reinventing the wheel and competing with existing standards, the interoperability, was the neutrality, was the idea that this proof of green specification, if it emerges, should not be owned by anyone. So it should not belong to, and it's been really encouraging, really, that you personally and the Affinity Foundation supported this vision fully. So you are sort of, you've invested in helping seed this proof of green concept, even though you will not own it at the end. This idea that actually it creates its own foundation, which is sort of where everybody has an equal vote. It doesn't matter whether they funded it or not, where you have academics and you have civil society and you have blockchains all represented. And that creates that kind of neutral space. So I wanted to first just celebrate the fact that that to me is that evidence of authenticity, but also authenticity. It's a very competitive space. And I think that's a reality, right? Blockchains are competing with each other. So having the kind of generosity and courage and confidence to say, we've incubated this and we're happy to kind of let it go, deserves respect. I did want to ask you a question beyond the Internet Computer. So the Internet Computer has the advantage of sort of a particular infrastructure. You really can tell exactly where each node is. You can get them to notify you, and you, at this stage, control all of that sort of communication. Is not the same for others, right? It's harder for other blockchains to build a kind of dashboard with the same ease. So how did you see the roadmap being in that sense for more sort of diversified, more decentralized blockchains and validators? What is required to be able to gather that information, to be able to say, to create something like what you guys have created, I guess?
Well, one small correction, just as any blockchain person gets freaked when you say you control the communication. We don't control any communication. I mean, it is an autonomous network, blah, blah, blah. But I think
yes, okay. It was. I actually clarified that was a poor, an awkward summary. No, it's completely decentralized. What I mean is that you have visibility and access into those processes.
Exactly. But I think, I mean, there are many things that other networks can do, and I think, I mean, anyone from Amazon to Google to Ethereum or whatever can have the protocol. I mean, the ultimate situation is the same in every network. There is a protocol running on a machine, and the protocol can tell the machine, hey, report these numbers, or if, I mean, it's any sort of modern machine, it will have a power consumption monitoring system. Okay, if it's a mobile phone or a Raspberry Pi, maybe not. but generally you could ask many devices or many servers at least to self-report. But this requires then, making a change to perhaps the Ethereum core protocol, which is it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So the next time it happens in next year or the year after, it could be that they ask the machines to self-report if they can. But I think, yeah, generally for me with the proof of green, it was more just also about having this kind of open conversation, bringing people to the table, bringing people together to try and form this common language of like, okay, yeah, we can do this. Maybe you can't, maybe they can do it partially, but how are we all going to come to a common understanding? Because me saying I'm the greenest and you saying, no, you're the greenest, and all we care about transactions, all we care about nodes, all we care about operations, all we care about cycles. Like, yeah, we all care about everything all the time, but this doesn't make for a very meaningful conversation, and it just pulls things in too many different directions. So I think having these sort of roundtables with people around the table that literally kind of go, okay, I care about this. And like the thing is, we all agree at the end of the day. So I think it's just a matter of coming together, writing down all the things that we care about, taking this principled approach, maybe prioritizing some things over some other things, and yeah, just generally coming to some sort of agreed language, common language.
And that's very helpful because it does illustrate that diversity. And that's why, again, it's about description rather than validation. So I certainly don't see in the foreseeable future, at least, proof of green actually saying you proved you're green, gold certificates, etc. Because again, that would be just sort of polarizing and inappropriate in that sense. It's more about being able to say, what is the conversation? So the approach that the Internet Computer took, it's going to be different to the approach that Ethereum takes, but you can describe it in a common language because it's got some common core ingredients and we are not reinventing the wheel. We know what it is. So as long as you can talk about it together, then that's possible, which sort of, I guess, allows me to sort of invite you to then comment on bringing this together in that sense as someone who is building directly on top of blockchains. You will be sort of your technology is around sort of having some metrics that come in that you're able to validate and say, these are the emissions, these are the offsets. How do you see that landscape in terms of doing that for the blockchains that sort of you're building on top?
Yeah.
Ismail, I'm sorry, just to say, I will have to leave now. I have
sure,
to go to another assignment.
Thank you for joining us. You made a fantastic contribution. Very appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone at the roundtable. It was really interesting and nice meeting all of you. Continue at your leisure.
Thank you
Have
very
a nice
much.
day. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye. And this is the last question. So I'll let you and
I think we've highlighted the challenges, right? I think one of them is that some of the tools just weren't able to be implemented in the way that they were imagined. So I'm just thinking of the frameworks with the greenhouse gas protocol. There was no guidance on how to look at blockchains, whether it was proof of work or proof of stake, right? So I think there's sort of an education aspect almost for people to understand how blockchains function, how things like smart contracts work, et cetera, so that you can start to implement tools that exist. And having some sort of common framework and understanding there, of course, is very important, right? There was another theme that was brought up a little bit about, what's the spectrum that you're looking at here to make a decision on, maybe where you want to end up on a blockchain, which blockchain are you using, and so on. And of course, this was important for us. And so when we started having these working groups with different carbon registries about blockchain, they were very concerned with the sustainability, of course, but that's only one aspect for us, right? Because yes, we want to be on a sustainable chain, but then the next piece is, okay, which chain is going to really help us ramp up our impact and, frankly, be a business decision where we can start to connect with other players and so on. And so we looked at that. And I mean, that's things related to the amount of liquidity on the chain, the number of developers are there and so on, because ultimately you want to be in a vibrant community where people can really build together. And of course, we do have cross-chain collaboration and so on, I think is Ollie brought up, but then you get into issues of interoperability and so on. And it just so happens that we are in a working group together with ICR and a number of other players in the space to talk about that, the interoperability and the composability of the tech, and starting to help standardize things so that we can pull in the best of the work that's happening on these different chains together to enhance our impact. Of course, part of that should be the environmental impact of these chains and everything. But once we have that settled, then we need to shoot for what are the missions that we're after here? How do we make impact? How can we start to use blockchains as tools to have a positive contribution in the fight against climate change?
Thank you. And I think this is a really important point. And again, one of the sort of core goals of Proof of Green was to facilitate that element of interoperability. That's what the Open API specs, the async API specs, what they did was enable people to predict, and the underlying technologies are completely different. There's literally no point of contact between one API and another API under the hood, but that predictability allowed interoperability in a way that had never happened before. And the hope is that similarly, even though there's going to be so much diversity in the implementation of carbon metrics, that if we can have a common format for description, you can automate all kinds of APIs on top of that, all kinds of interactions and things. And one of the things that sort of strikes me is that there are two drivers for this that I can see, or maybe three drivers, but one is that it's a business necessity, that actually we can't scale unless this talks to each other in some way, right? That actually the blockchain is not a monolith, but it is one technology. So, whilst people within each blockchain ecosystem really care about their ecosystem, sort of the end users, the finance world, those outside the choir are not thinking, which tribe do I belong? They're thinking, where does this ecosystem fit? And so creating that foundation, that's been driven in that sense by people like yourselves. And then the other element is regulation. Sort of the EU has just commissioned 800,000 euros worth of a report on emissions metrics and included looking at the feasibility of standards. So it's coming. And if we can anticipate this, then we can inform it and we can shape it. So I want to end by thanking you really profoundly for your time. You made time to travel here to this venue to have this conversation. I think it's been a very substantive one. I think it's been very rich. I think it has opened up sort of pathways. I think for our sort of viewers, they will walk away with sort of not just information, but I imagine you'll get sort of hits on your website, some knocks at your door. And it is also, I guess, to leave with an invitation to be part of this process of discussion around this Proof of Green approach. This idea that it's a neutral space. The last principle is that it's a diverse space, that this should not be a standard that's just created by one sector. So we need every one of our perspectives and voices to be able to go, this is what I need from this standard. And this is what I care about as well. And the goal is to create something that reconciles that diversity as opposed to forced binary choices. So it's not just chain agnostic, but sort of really ecosystem in the broadest sense. So on behalf of the Adora Foundation, thank you for your time. I hope we will continue the conversation from here. And to all of you who are watching this, thank you again for joining us, and look forward to collaborating on the next stage.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.